Our journey today begins in Russia, in St. Petersburg, in 1908. Here, at the Tsarskoye Selo, just outside the city, inside the private quarters of the Imperial Palace, the Tsarina Alexandra, Empress of Russia, stands with her children and a trusted confidant. One by one she arranges them, carefully, deliberately, each daughter placed with quiet precision, the future of the dynasty gathered in white. And Alexei, the young heir, the boy on whom everything rests, brought close to the centre. Their positions adjusted, refined, composed. This is not a casual moment. This is a private photograph, but one designed to endure in the family memory. Then she pauses and makes space at the very centre, the place where the eye will fall, the place of importance, a space reserved for the man in the picture. And when we look at that image today, we can't help but be intrigued by it. Taken inside the private world of the Romanovs, a real photograph showing the Tsarina, her children, and beside her, not her husband, but Grigori Rasputin, dishevelled, rough, a face that does not belong in a royal portrait. And the questions begin to form immediately. How did this man, a wandering peasant, a mystic, come to stand at the very heart of the most powerful family in Russia? Why is he here? How did Rasputin gain such influence over the Tsarina herself? Was there any truth to the rumours? Was he a lover of the Russian queen? To understand how this man, who seems so out of place in Russian high society, came to stand at the centre of the Russian Empire, we must start at the beginning. Grigori Rasputin was born around 1869 in the Siberian village of Pokrovskoy. His was a world of long winters, wooden houses, and lives shaped by hardship rather than privilege. He was the son of a peasant family, with no formal education and no clear path beyond what he was born into. And yet, in early adulthood, something begins to change. Rasputin appears to undergo a profound spiritual awakening. Later accounts speak of visions and religious experiences, though exactly what caused this transformation remains unclear. He is drawn deeply towards the traditions of the Russian Orthodox faith. To such an extent he becomes what the Russians call a stranik, a religious wanderer. And so, he travels across Russia, visiting monasteries, holy places, and preaches his own interpretation of the faith. Such a man might have been ignored by all but the most devout. But even at this early stage, his reputation begins to spread. Even those who disliked him acknowledged certain traits he possessed. The intensity of his eyes, his unsettling calmness in conversation, and his ability to hold attention far beyond what his rough appearance should have allowed. But alongside fascination came suspicion. Some church figures begin to view him with concern. Reports circulate questioning both his behaviour and the nature of his beliefs. Rumours begin to spread that Rasputin had connections to fringe religious movements, groups accused of mixing spirituality with the pleasures of the flesh. No definite proof of this has ever emerged, but the whispers followed him for the rest of his life. And so, from the very beginning, two versions of Rasputin begin to take shape. Some see spirituality, others see danger. By the first years of the 20th century, Rasputin's wandering journeys carry him to St. Petersburg, to the very heart of Russian power. And within that world, we find Alexandra. Born in 1872, Princess Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, raised within the ordered traditions of Europe's royal courts. Her place in Russia is not inherited, it is chosen. In 1894, she marries Nicholas II, a union built not on politics, but on love and personal devotion. Leaving behind the Lutheran faith of her childhood, she converts to Russian Orthodoxy and takes a new name, Alexandra Feodorovna. And in the years that follow, their family grows. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, four healthy, beautiful daughters. And behind the rigid formality of court life was genuine affection. Letters, diaries, and photographs reveal a close and deeply devoted family. And then, in 1904, both parents are overjoyed by the birth of their son, Alexei, the Tsarevich. For Alexandra, there is enormous relief. She has fulfilled the deepest wish of her husband and provided a male heir to the Romanov dynasty, a child that would one day inherit the throne and continue a family line that had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries. But within this loving household, a terrible realization slowly begins to grow. A private fear, one Alexandra increasingly blames herself for, because the long-awaited heir to the Romanov dynasty is sick. And as that fear deepens, one of the most improbable relationships in modern history will begin to form between the Empress of all Russia and a wandering peasant from Siberia. From the moment he is born, something is not right. Alexei suffers from a condition that few can fully explain and no one can cure: hemophilia, a disorder of the blood where the body struggles to stop bleeding properly. Even a minor injury can be deadly serious, and while a cut or an external wound could sometimes be managed, compressed, controlled, internal bleeding caused by a fall, a knock, or a bruise was far more dangerous, because there were places inside the body that no doctor could reach. And more than this, not only was Alexei incredibly fragile, he was suffering constantly, as childhood is full of bumps and bruises. However, the Tsar and the Tsarina decided that the truth of Alexei's condition could never be allowed to become public. This was because they knew the strength of the Romanov dynasty rested upon what people believed about it, and in a monarchy that justified itself through divine authority, a sickly heir could invite dangerous thoughts. This, after all, was a time when the Romanov dynasty already lived beneath the shadow of political violence. Nicholas's own grandfather, Tsar Alexander II, had been assassinated by revolutionaries only a generation earlier. At this moment, it was vital the stability of the dynasty could not be seen to weaken. And so, the truth is confined to a small circle: doctors, attendants, those closest to the family. And beyond that, silence. No one else, even extended family, could be allowed to know. The risk to the monarchy was simply too great. It is also worth noting that for Alexandra, the burden of Alexei's condition is deeply personal. This is because hemophilia was not entirely unknown within Europe's royal houses. The disease had already appeared among descendants of Queen Victoria, and by the 1900s it was known that, although women could carry the condition, it most often manifested itself within the sons who inherited it. And so Alexandra comes to believe that it is her bloodline that has brought the disease into the Romanov dynasty. She thinks she is the cause of the fragility to the Romanov house, and for a deeply religious woman, the guilt of this becomes unbearable. Unfortunately, medicine of the 20th century could do little beyond easing Alexei's suffering and hoping that the bleeding would stop on its own. Doctors had no answer. Instead, they told Alexandra to simply prepare for the worst. And it is within this state of secrecy, fear, hope, and desperation that the name Grigori Rasputin first begins moving toward the Imperial family. During his years in St. Petersburg, Rasputin has gained a reputation among sections of the Russian elite for his intense spirituality, hypnotic presence, and supposed gifts of healing and prophecy. Amongst aristocrats already fascinated by mysticism and holy men, his name spreads quickly. Some are disturbed by him, and others utterly fascinated. But almost everyone who encounters the Siberian mystic remembers him, until eventually in 1905, 2 aristocratic sisters close to the royal family, Princess Militsa and Princess Anastasia of Montenegro, bring word of Rasputin to Alexandra herself, and the timing could hardly have been more significant, because unknown to those outside the palace, the Empress is desperately seeking someone who might be able to help her child, someone who might succeed where medicine has failed. And so, Rasputin is invited into the private world of the Romanovs. Accounts of the first meetings between Alexandra and Rasputin are limited, and are often shaped by those who later try to explain Rasputin's astonishing rise. But one thing is clear: Rasputin is brought into the presence of the young Tsarevich, and during moments of crisis, his presence appears to coincide with improvement. Whether through coincidence, calm reassurance, prayer, or something far harder to explain, around Rasputin, Alexei seems to recover. The pain eases, the bleeding subsides, and hope returns. For Alexandra, that is enough. From that moment onward, Rasputin is no longer merely a wandering Siberian holy man. He becomes an essential part of the private life of the imperial family, not because the court accepts him, but because Alexandra needs him. And once the Empress of Russia becomes convinced that this man may be able to save her son, the boy upon whom the future of the Romanov dynasty depends, then few people in the empire will ever truly be able to remove him. As the years pass, Rasputin's presence within the world of the Romanovs begins to grow. At first, his visits appear occasional, a spiritual figure invited during moments of anxiety and crisis. But gradually, the Siberian peasant is seen within the private rooms of the palace, speaking directly with the Empress, corresponding with her, spending time not only with Alexei, but with the Tsar's wife and daughters. And in the rigid hierarchy of Imperial Russia, this is extraordinary. Around Rasputin, fascination and unease begin to grow together, because beyond the palace walls, no one truly understands why he is there. The illness of the Tsarevich still remains secret, and the public never see Alexei suffering, nor the fear consuming Alexandra. What they can see is Rasputin, and his extraordinary access to the Empress herself. Servants talk, staff gossip, and soon fragments of Alexandra's private correspondence spread beyond the palace. In them, Alexandra is seen to write to Rasputin with deep warmth and emotion. The language is intensely personal, deeply religious, and outside the private reality of the palace, it feels incredibly intimate. Then there are the photographs, images of Rasputin beside the imperial children, near the Tsarina herself, images that seem to violate the invisible rules of monarchy. And so, the rumours begin to spread. Quietly at first, then louder, that the relationship between Rasputin and the Empress extends beyond matters of the faith. No evidence has ever been found that conclusively proves such a claim, but in many ways, proof begins to matter less and less, because to much of Russian society, Rasputin's presence already feels impossible to explain. And outside the palace, his reputation does little to silence the whispers. The troubling stories that had followed him from his earlier years now begin attaching themselves to the imperial court itself. There are accounts of drinking, of crude behaviour, of women drawn into his orbit. Eventually, concerns surrounding Rasputin grow significant enough that the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, begin monitoring his movements, and the fact that the state itself is watching him reveals just how serious the concern has become. Reports describe a man moving freely through society, drinking heavily, and growing increasingly comfortable with admiration, influence, and excess. Indeed, outside the palace, the man welcomed into the private quarters of the Romanovs does not seem to act like a holy man at all. But inside the palace, one fact continues to outweigh all others. When Rasputin is around, Alexei's condition improves, and for Alexandra, that matters more than any gossip, scandal, or rumour ever could. She is convinced Rasputin is protecting her son, and is the miracle she once prayed for. And so, she begins to protect him in the face of growing unease within her household. But the rumours surrounding Rasputin only intensify and spread outward across the whole of Russia. Pamphlets begin to circulate, satirical cartoons appear, and at the centre of it all are questions that few can answer. Why is this peasant so close to the Romanovs? Why is he tolerated? And why does the Empress defend him so fiercely? But these questions are only ever met with silence. And the more Alexandra protects Rasputin, the more society begins to suspect the relationship itself. The more Nicholas tolerates his presence, the weaker the Tsar himself appears. And now a new question begins to manifest. If this man can't provide protection for his own family, is he even fit to rule Russia? By the outbreak of the First World War, the relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin has already become one of the most controversial subjects in Russia. But as the empire begins to fracture under the pressure of war, that relationship grows even more dangerous. In 1915, Nicholas II makes a decision that will alter the balance of the monarchy itself. Believing his presence is needed at the front, the Tsar leaves Petrograd to take personal command of the Russian army. And in doing so, he leaves Alexandra increasingly isolated at the centre of government. The consequences are profound. For while Nicholas is absent amongst the mud, confusion and catastrophe of the Eastern Front, inside the imperial capital, another influence remains close to the throne: Rasputin. By now, Alexandra's trust in him is deepened beyond simple spiritual guidance. She believes he protects Alexei, protects the dynasty, perhaps even protects Russia itself, and increasingly, she listens to him. While the Tsar's at the front, letters pass continually between him and his wife, and within them we see a rise in Rasputin's influence. Again and again, Alexandra urges Nicholas to trust Rasputin, to listen to "our friend," a phrase that appears repeatedly throughout their correspondence. She even presses Nicholas to remove officials she believes are disloyal, weak, or hostile towards Rasputin himself. And so, during the war years, Russia's government begins to suffer from constant instability. Ministers rise and fall in rapid succession. Positions shift repeatedly. Confidence inside the administration starts to erode. It begins to seem as though power inside the empire no longer flows through institutions or government, or even the Tsar himself, but through the strange relationship between Alexandra and the Siberian mystic she refuses to abandon. However, beyond the palace walls, the image this creates becomes catastrophic. Russia is suffering terribly. Food shortages deepen. Military defeats continue. Confidence in the government begins to collapse. And as the Russian soldiers die at the front, dark whispers begin spreading through Petrograd itself, that the Tsarina is under the influence of Rasputin. By late 1916, the atmosphere has become toxic. Aristocrats speak openly of disaster. Members of the royal family express alarm. Some begin convincing themselves that removing Rasputin is necessary. Necessary to save the throne. Necessary to save Russia itself. And so, a conspiracy begins forming around a young aristocrat, Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia, a figure from the very highest levels of society. In December 1916, Rasputin receives an invitation from Felix to come to the Yusupov Palace in Petrograd. And when he makes his way there, through the winter darkness, that strange relationship that had once drawn a wandering Siberian mystic into the private life of the Romanovs finally comes to an end. In the early hours of December the 30th, 1916, Grigori Rasputin was dead. The details of the murder would quickly pass into legend. Poison, gunshots, a body cast into the frozen waters of the Neva. But, like so much surrounding Rasputin, the story itself soon became tangled in exaggeration, contradiction, and myth. Some of those involved in the murder would later help shape the tale, turning the death of the Siberian mystic into something almost supernatural. And perhaps that is fitting, because even today there remain aspects of the Rasputin story that are difficult to fully explain, such as the reason for Alexei's apparent recovery when he was around. Modern historians have proposed many explanations. that Rasputin had a calming presence that reduced stress around the child. The doctors at the time may have unknowingly worsened Alexei's condition with their treatments, and perhaps one of these explanations is correct. Or perhaps it was something else. Unknown. And so, we arrive at the question that followed Rasputin through both life and death. Was he truly the lover of the Russian queen? No definitive evidence has ever proven that a physical relationship existed between Rasputin and Alexandra. Most historians today regard the affair as exaggeration, fueled by wartime suspicion, political hostility, and the secrecy surrounding his presence in the palace. But in the final years of the Romanov dynasty, the distinction had almost ceased to matter, because millions of people believed it. And in a monarchy built upon image and authority, belief itself became dangerous enough. Only months after Rasputin's death, Russia descended into revolution, and the Romanov Empire came to an end. What did survive, however, was the legend of Rasputin. For the relationship between an empress and a peasant from Siberia was once very real, and once the fate of a dynasty, an empire, the life of a young son, and a mother's heart, all seemed to rest upon it, even if only for a whisper in time.